Some people are not ready for life planning, and that's okay. There's going to be 5 factors that are important elements in anybody's lives. That's why they call it personal finance, right? It's very personal. There is an actual human being behind this finance. It's not just a bunch of numbers.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Proof of Words podcast. I'm, as always, your host, Patrick, and today we are joined by Morgen Rochard, a financial advisor and author. Morgen, thank you for joining us on the Proof of Words podcast. Maybe if you would be so kind to give a quick introduction to yourself.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on, Patrick. So I'm a financial planner. My firm is about 10 years old. In August of 2024, it'll be 10. It's celebrating its anniversary. I started my career, though, actually as a coffee girl on the floor of the American Stock Exchange a long time ago.
Really?
Yeah. And then I was...
The Stock Exchange has its own baristas, or was it a coffee runner?
No, I was a coffee runner. Yeah, I was a runner. So, no, I didn't even make the coffee. I just took the order.
I had my years of that at PwC.
And then came back with the coffee. And I learned some things, right? I was an intern and, they were nice enough to show me trading. And then they actually, they promoted me and I became a trader. I worked in an upstairs office trading equity options, and I worked downstairs on the floor of the American Stock Exchange for a while, trading as both just a trader and then a specialist. In roughly 50 names on the American Stock Exchange. And then from there, it wasn't a good alignment with who I am personally. I think it's very high stress. It's very fast moving. It's very disconnected, I feel like, from reality. You're kind of just like, in a pit pushing paper around. That's how it felt to me. And so I moved into wealth management. I started in wealth management at Merrill Lynch. I worked for a very large financial advisory team where we had, international clients doing very complex things, which is why they hired me. They wanted to look at options trading and Forex trading and all this stuff for their sophisticated clients. And then from there, I switched teams and then moved to UBS. And then I got really a taste of what all the wirehouses were about, just being at both places. And I saw that, it was really nice to work with clients and I liked what I was doing. I just didn't really necessarily like where I was doing it. And that it seemed to me that I needed to do something else or find a different way to do it. And so 10 years ago, I started my own firm. And again, I sort of still had in this mindset that, people wanted these sophisticated, crazy strategies and stuff. And what I learned over time from just running my own practice was that people just needed real financial planning. And they needed help with that. And then they needed asset allocation, and they didn't need all these complicated things going on in their portfolios. And at the end of the day, really, when we were tracking returns and so forth, when I worked in wealth management, the returns weren't even that much better than, let's say, just holding the stock market. And in some cases they were worse. And so it was a real eye opener to me of what real families actually need rather than what wealth managers think people need.
And I think a lot of people, specifically in our industry, in the Bitcoin and the crypto space, they naturally just think of wealth management and wealth planning as, okay, I'm going to put money in Bitcoin or maybe the latest, hottest shitcoin, and hopefully number goes up. And that's my whole entire wealth strategy plan. Maybe if you could elaborate a little bit around what the kind of intricacies of wealth planning are, from retirement, estate, taxation, et cetera. What is it that a wealth manager like you actually performs for their job?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I like to take it all the way back to first principles. And to me, that's the basis of everything is life planning. And so life planning is, it was basically created by this guy named George Kinder. And it takes clients through a series of 3 meetings where we cast a really wide net on what's important to people. And then we help them narrow it down. And then from there, we help them knock out any obstacles that might get in their way of actually doing that plan. And in a life plan, it sounds kind of like woo-woo, I think, especially when you're thinking of a wealth manager. You don't think of going to a coach and having them help you through these things. But money weaves its way through every aspect of our lives. And so we don't set the stage with what's the purpose? What's the meaning behind this? What are the intentions that we have for our money? Then we don't really get to the heart of what all the other services somebody actually needs. And so we start there. And for everybody, there's going to be 5 factors that are important elements in anybody's lives. And so the first is family, right? Family is very important to people, and money weaves through family. You can see very clearly, things cost money. You want to put food on the table for your kids, or you want to pay for education or whatever else it is, right? And there's all sorts of planning that goes around, providing for your family, right? And then the second thing is community, right? Some people, they want to help not just their family, they want to help beyond the community. And so that's also money is going to weave through there. The third thing is spirituality for a lot of people, right? They're connected to a higher purpose, or like the creator in my experience. I mean, I believe there's one true creator that put us here up for a purpose. And so, that's going to weave into people's financial plans as well. There's also creativity. So creativity, I like to use that in a bunch of different ways, right? That could be like your hobbies or things that you're doing outside of work, but also people are creative in their work. And for a lot of people, their work is very, very important to them. And it's what provides meaning and purpose and intention in their lives. And so, of course, like there's all sorts of factors with money that weaves through that. And then the last thing is just your place in the world. Like, where do you fit? How do we fit in this whole world, and where am I supposed to be, and how am I making this world a better place? And so, again, money weaves through every single aspect of all five of these and sets the stage for a life plan. And I think it's really important to start there because we all have shiny object syndrome, I think, in one way or another, right? Some people have it more than others, but everyone has a little bit of that of like, oh, I want this and I want it now, and I can get it delivered to my doorstep in less than 24 hours. And so it's really easy to sort of go off the path because of shiny object syndrome, and to be able to say, you know, oh, I want to do XYZ thing or whatever it is that's different than what came up in somebody's life plan. And if you're starting with the plan, then when somebody starts going off plan, you can remind them of being like, hey, you know, 6 months ago, you said that it was really important that you spend more time with your family, and that, you know, that you're saving for a specific goal or whatever it is. And when something else comes up, like I want to buy a much bigger house than, let's say, somebody can afford, or leverage long Bitcoin because they think that they're going to make more money doing so, right? Then you can remind somebody through their life plan that maybe that's not necessarily what's important and what's going to make the most for them in their lives. From there, we do all sorts of what I would call traditional financial planning, what people think of when they think of financial planning, which is like, you know, how much house can I afford, or how much do I need to save for retirement? How much do I need to save for kids' college? Making sure that we're crunching those numbers for people, doing scenario analysis on anything that came up during their life planning, making sure that we're minimizing taxes wherever it's appropriate, obviously, like legally, not any kind of crazy evasion strategies. Yeah.
Not like the taxation is theft mentality like I have. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then, creating a retirement plan for people, and then also making sure their estate plan is in place. I feel like the estate planning is often something that people don't really want to think about. And insurance as well. It's one of these things that you don't want to think about death or dying or disability, right? And, you know, we're here as financial advisors to always bring up the topics that people don't want to talk about, but that are very important, and that really make a difference should something happen. And so all of that, I would say, is what we call comprehensive financial planning. But I feel like the term kind of comprehensive financial planning doesn't really mean anything when somebody says it. You have to actually explain all the aspects of it.
So, I mean, it's very interesting that you put it that way because, I remember, when I was a kid, I studied for the CFA exams. I've noticed you're a CFA yourself as well. I got through level 2 and then I didn't even bother taking level 3. But I remember that there was a lot of information in those packets around this, and every element that I was ever taught around financial and wealth management was entirely tied to literally just the numbers themselves. Nothing was ever really tied to the individuals and what their goals are. That's why I think it's really admirable that you and your firm try to really focus on understanding what an individual's goals are, understanding what an individual's life is like, and then helping them kind of plan everything from there. I mean, what kind of spoke to you, or why is it that you saw such a human element in financial and wealth management planning in that regard?
Yeah, I love that question. I think that, so with the CFA Institute, I actually feel like they really missed the mark.
Big time.
The level 3 exam is all about creating an investment policy statement. And it's very dry, the investment policy statement. And for your listeners, the investment policy statement is basically, it's a document about a client and why you're investing them the way that they are. And the client could be anywhere from an individual person, a family, an institution, a foundation, whatever it is, right? It could skew the gamut of types of investors that there are. But the investment policy statement doesn't include anything about who the person is that's actually investing and what the purpose of it is. It's like, it basically it puts all the numbers and facts about this person on paper, but dehumanizes it. And so, and this is not a knock on the CFA Institute by any stretch. I don't want them, to start coming after me.
Well, at the end of the day, these are numbers and these are practices from a financial perspective that people that do your job have to understand at a high level anyway. It's like my background is as an accountant, and I have to know how to book a double ledger system, right? I feel like that's just a base knowledge of what you need to know to be able to perform these types of roles, though, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess where it misses the mark, though, is that you have to connect that investment policy statement with an actual human individual, whether it's an institution or a foundation or just a family, right? There's still people behind that. Right, with an institution, they're investing for a purpose, right? And maybe that purpose is like listed as one line in the investment policy statement, but that purpose dictates the entire asset allocation. And so if we're not expanding upon that single sentence that's in there, and really getting to know who the people are, who are the beneficiaries of this, why are we doing what we're doing, then it's going to be really hard actually to make the right calls about asset allocation. And so there are consultants out there who, they go through and they have their little check boxes or whatever, and they say, oh, you have an investment policy statement. Check. Okay, good. You have, you wrote down that this person has unique goals and their time horizon. Check. It's like, okay, but why are you putting the check mark there? Like, where are we going from here? And so I feel like, for me, I guess part of my personality is that I'm curious and I like learning about people and I like understanding where people are coming from. And so I think that part of that made it very easy for me to sort of connect the two dots and say, okay, well, we need this investment policy statement, but we also have this person that we should really be learning about in order to make the investment policy statement be worth something. And really, when you put the two together, I think that's why they call it personal finance, right? It's very personal. There is an actual human being behind this finance. It's not just a bunch of numbers. And I often get asked in my practice, like, how people can optimize. And so I think optimization is one of these funny things, because the best way to optimize would be that you try to make as much money as you can. You spend as little money as possible, right? You eat ramen, you live in a tent, you don't do basically anything.
Yeah, but then you're not really living.
You only go to work,
right?
and spend 50 cents a day on food. And then you've optimized, right? Then you buy a very aggressive asset allocation, and you put it maybe even in retirement accounts because you don't need the money. Like, you can take all the tax deductions or whatever. Like, there's all sorts of ways to optimize, but it doesn't necessarily fit into people's lives. And so I kind of think that I always find that question to be funny, because it's like, okay, we can optimize, quote unquote, for your specific life and what you're doing. But like, at the end of the day, if we're really trying to optimize, right, like, we would be making all sorts of changes that are kind of irrelevant. And so I guess when people are thinking about like their own personal financial plans, you really have to think about who you are and what you're looking to do and why you're here. And I think a lot of the time when people are thinking about their financial plans, they're thinking about why they can escape their life and what they can do with their money, rather than like how to make their life meaningful and how to make it just their life be what they want to live, rather than trying to escape for a vacation or escape for whatever it is, right? And so buy a boat. I feel like I hear all these sites about like vacation over whatever it is, and maybe that is part of people's most fulfilled lives, but we like to really boil it down to like what's important to an individual human being and what they're trying to do here on earth. And then, if you need a break from that because you need to recharge and you want to go on a 2-week long vacation or whatever it is, right? That's really different than I want to travel the world forever because I don't want to lay roots anywhere. And so I feel like often, like, in wealth management specifically and in financial planning, these things get conflated because people's most fulfilled lives might not necessarily be what they think of when they're thinking of what would be, fulfilling and exciting. And you kind of have to also put the two together and balance that.
So have you ever had any difficulties, for lack of a better phrase, helping a client maybe come out of their shell a little bit? Because, for instance, like somebody, whenever they approach an individual like yourself, a professional like yourself, they might only have the mentality of, okay, how does this person help me generate wealth and preserve wealth, right? I mean, that's at the very basic bones what it is that you guys do. Have you ever had any difficulties working with a client trying to help them understand that there's a lot more to this, that maybe they're a more kind of stoic, reserved individual that doesn't yet see how all of these pieces of the puzzle kind of fit together in what their own personal life is, and aren't necessarily even willing to open up to you about what those personal life goals are, right? Because a lot of people just aren't willing to have that conversation. It almost sounds therapeutic in a certain regard.
Yeah, for sure. I think that some people are not ready for life planning, and that's okay. And some people are very ready for life planning and they didn't know that they were. And then there are other people who they're like, wow, that's the most exciting thing. I can't wait to get started. Right. And so we definitely have it across the gamut of people coming in. And we meet people where they are, right? If somebody's not ready to go through the process, we don't turn them away just because they do need financial planning. We always offer it up as something that people can do down the road. But what we do instead is we make sure we really get to know our client in a way that is pretty much mimics life planning, but doesn't make the client actually go through it, because we do feel like we don't get the right information that we need to actually provide the services that are appropriate for that client without doing that process. And so whether that means that the client goes through what we call mini life planning because they're okay with that, or no life planning, but we make them kind of go through some questionnaires and other things that we would put people through when they're doing life planning. And then instead of doing it through the process, we just use that information to engage through a longer meeting than we otherwise would have, like in a typical financial planning meeting. Life planning meetings for couples are always 2 hours per meeting, and there's 3 of them. For an individual, it's an hour and a half. And so, and then typical financial planning meetings are anywhere between 45 minutes to an hour. And so we generally still ask for the same hour and a half or 2 hours for these meetings that are not life planning, quote unquote. And so we find ways around it where we can meet the client where they are. And if a client is really opposed to it, obviously, they're opposed to it, and that's fine. Either if we don't feel like we're getting what we need to make sure that their financial plan it would be secure, then maybe they're not the right client for our practice, and that's okay. We try to just have clients find the financial planner that they need rather than like us just trying to take people in and try to fit them into our mold. I don't think that necessarily works. And I do think that there's a match out there for everybody, right? Just like everybody has a soulmate out there waiting for them to complete them, right? There's a financial planner out there for everybody that can really help fit the mold of what's important to somebody, right?
Oh, fantastically put. So, to the crux of the conversation I was hoping to dive into today. I mean, obviously you are a Bitcoiner. To you, coming from the financial planning, personal financial planning, wealth management space, what is Bitcoin?
Yeah, so Bitcoin to me is a savings technology. It's a money. And so I often hear people saying, oh, should I invest in Bitcoin? And it's like, screech on the chalkboard. It's like, no,
it's always the wrong question to ask. I always tell everybody the exact same thing whenever somebody asks me, like, oh, should I put money into Bitcoin? What price do I put it into Bitcoin? And it's like, you're starting on the wrong foot already.
Yeah. Yeah. And so money is, right, it's a medium of exchange. It's a unit of account. It's a store of value. And so I think what's often lost on people with this is that in order for money to be a medium of exchange, it has to be a good store of value. And so, right, if you're thinking about it, if I'm going to pay you, Patrick, for something, and you don't think that whatever I'm going to pay you in, right, if I'm going to pay you in Morgen coin, if you don't think Morgen coin is going to hold any value, you're not going to let me pay you in Morgen coin because it's worthless, right? Even if Morgen coin has value right here, this second while we're talking, if you don't think in 10 minutes from now Morgen coin is going to have value, right? You won't exchange it.
You're telling me you're going to rug pull me now?
There is no Morgen coin. I'm just throwing a hypothetical example out there, and there will never be a Morgen coin. So, like, if all the spammers online are starting to jump on that, please, I'm not trying to just scam anybody.
I'm assuming there's going to be a Morgen coin on Uniswap in the next 20 minutes. We're in the 20 minutes after we post this podcast.
But to get back to medium exchange, that basically, right, the reason why people are exchanging dollars, right, is that even though there's no promise of long-term store of value with dollars, right? There is a promise of short-term store of value for a dollar, right? You can expect that your dollar today, if I go and pay you for a coffee or whatever else it is, that you'll be able to, hold those dollars long enough to either be able to invest them into something else or save them, for 2 to 3 months or an hour, whatever it is, right? And so people are able to use the dollar because of that. With Bitcoin, it's the same thing, right? It's a store of value, right? In essence, and maybe it's not a good short-term store of value, right? It's the opposite of, let's say, the dollar, but it's a really good long-term store of value, and therefore people are willing to use it as a medium of exchange, right? Because they know that in the future it will be worth more. And so I feel like that's often lost on people because medium of exchange, people just think, oh, like it's just what I pay for things with. I don't really need to think about store of value, but the whole reason why you're able to use it for that purpose is because of that. And then the last thing obviously is unit of account. And the unit of account, I think, is the most important part with Bitcoin because if we think about what's going around the world with not just dollars, but with fiat currencies in general, right? Unit of account is constantly changing, but people aren't thinking about that because they're not thinking about what the velocity of money is, right? It's like a very, very complicated economic topic for people. And so The way I'd like to break this down is actually if you imagine, let's say there was a standard board for rulers and for measurements. And so imagine like instead of the Federal Reserve Board, there was the Federal Rulers Board. And in that, they decided that, 1 inch, if you have an inch, right, you can have 12 inches in a foot. And then one day they're like, you know what, 12 inches in a foot, it's really not working for people anymore. And even though, like, there's tens of thousands of people building
It's like the
houses.
crazy Europeans that use that meters and kilometers nonsense, right? Like, what the hell are they thinking over there? They just change the
You're just
rules
going
for
to change the
whatever
rules
reason.
for whatever reason. But instead of it being, 12 inches, let's make it 13 inches. And then you're in the middle of building your house, and all of a sudden you go to buy wood, and now a foot is a different length than it used to be. And so all of your measurements mid-house are off. And you're like, what do I do here? And it's very complicated, right? And you're doing all this math and you're trying to figure out how to build your house. And then if, let's say, you're still not done with your house because they made it super complicated, they're like, actually, we realized 13 is not really the right number. It should really be 11. And then they change it drastically in the other direction. And now again, you're like, your measurements are all off. And so we don't often think about this with our money, but that's actually what's happening with our money all the time. And the reason why Bitcoin is really interesting and exciting, I think, is because the unit account is actually stable. Like, we know what the monetary policy is. We know how much Bitcoin is being created, so to speak, like through the block incentive. And we know like when the last Satoshi will be mined, right? And so all of this stuff makes it really interesting, I think, from a money perspective of like, okay, the unit of account is really stable. From a long-term perspective, right, there's a store of value, and therefore it could be used as a medium of exchange. And so when I'm talking to clients about it, I'm talking to them about how they can save in this and how it's a really good long-term savings vehicle. And it's something that we've never had before, right? We don't have long-term savings vehicles. We have short-term savings vehicles and we have investment, but we don't have a long-term savings vehicle. And that's, I think, like the brilliance of Bitcoin.
So I think it's absolutely brilliant the way that you put this, because, for instance, whenever anybody comes to me and asks about Bitcoin, what is Bitcoin? How does it work? Should I invest in Bitcoin? Like I said, I always say you're starting off on the wrong foot if that's your first question, because I fundamentally don't think people will understand Bitcoin if they don't understand money. Because, and you come from a financial academic background similar to myself, where everything that we've been taught throughout the entirety of our academics, through me doing the CPA license, you getting a CFA charter, the answer to what is money is, okay, it's the dollar, it's the euro, it's the ruble, and shut up, don't ask any questions beyond that. It's unfortunate, but that's just the way that it is. But when you start to actually really study what money is, and you study all of the different types of money that humanity has used throughout history, for better or for worse, you start to realize how flawed the majority of the financial systems that we've had on Earth is. I mean, at the end of the day, I feel like the best money that we've created up until recently was effectively gold, because that was a good unit of account. It was a very good store of value. Unit of account, maybe not so great, but good store of value. It could be used as a medium of exchange, but it was difficult because it's hard to lumber gold around. It's easy to be stolen. I mean, that's why back in the medieval ages, people would have their gold stolen all the time, right? But this is where I feel if you start people off on the foot of learning what money is, and in Bitcoin and in crypto, everything we do is around education. If you teach people what money is, they more naturally understand Bitcoin. They more naturally understand why Bitcoin has value. So I actually really commend you for taking that similar approach. Now, whenever you're talking with clients as to how Bitcoin is allocated within a part of their portfolio, it's this long-term savings asset. What type of advice is it that you're giving them? I can't imagine it's, okay, just go out and smash buy as much Bitcoin as much as possible. And I have to imagine it's not even DCAing into Bitcoin. I assume that there's probably something much more methodical tied to their own personal goals, whether it's wealth generation, long-term savings, etc., that maybe is unique to each and every client. Because, like, for instance, coming from my side, more on the asset management element of this, right? Not wealth management, but just purely financial product side. I always say, look, you just have to assess what level of risk is appropriate for yourself. And I always tell people, I believe you should have anywhere between 1 to 10% of your overall net worth allocated into Bitcoin. You should be at minimum 1%, just in case idiots like me out there in the world that are shouting Bitcoin are 1% correct. I mean, you don't want to miss the boat on that front. But depending on your risk tolerance, you should have a higher allocation. So what is it that you discuss with your clients whenever they're kind of going down this rabbit hole and finally understand what money in Bitcoin is?
Yeah, so Bitcoin is a long-term savings vehicle. It's not a good short-term savings vehicle. And so the whole basis of life planning, I think, is to really just decide what is needed in a client's portfolio over the short term and what is not needed over the short term, right? What can be invested or saved for the long term. And so, and for a lot of people, maybe it's just a simple answer, right? It's like, okay, well, I only need 3 to 6 months worth of an emergency fund, worth of expenses for an emergency fund, and the rest of it's really long term. I don't need any of it. I have enough. My income more than covers everything I need, and everything's fine. And I have really stable income, right? There's a lot of things that are going to play into that. And you mentioned risk tolerance, and I think that that also plays into it too. Risk tolerance is divided up into both ability to take risk and willingness to take risk. People often think of it only as willingness. Willingness is, exactly what it sounds. Do I like going to the slot machines and deciding what, how much money you're going to put a lot of money into a slot machine, right? Maybe you'd have more willingness to take risk. Like I find that unpalatable. I think, I could never do something like that. If you're more willing to skydive or bungee jump, generally people have more willingness to take risks, right? If you look at a chart of something and it really doesn't affect you at all, and you've actually been invested, let's say, in a stock that's super volatile, or in Bitcoin that's, if you've been holding Bitcoin for a while and it's volatile and doesn't really affect you, right? That's willingness to take risk. However, ability plays in, I'd say, as much, if not more so, because somebody can have very, very high willingness to take risk, but they might not have any savings, in which case they have no ability to take risk whatsoever, right? Somebody who has no emergency fund and who has very unstable income, right, has basically no ability to take risk, and therefore it doesn't even matter how much willingness they have to take risk. And so willingness is
or even like a couple, if they have a whole bunch of kids, has to be lack of an ability to take risk in that as well too. You can't just think about your own personal wealth. You got to think about the kids as well too. So maybe you need a larger slush fund.
Yeah, and so it's all really kind of dependent too, I would say, on like income as well. Like how stable is your income? How much, how big is the difference between your income and your expenses, right? Like what's that your net savings that you have, and how stable is that net savings? How often you're being paid is another thing, right? Some people get paid really choppy and they're not necessarily sure if what's going to come in is what they're actually going to see, versus somebody who just gets a very steady paycheck twice a month, right? It's a different story. How much in net worth you have, right? Somebody who has negative net worth is going to have very different ability versus, Elon Musk, right? For Elon Musk to put, let's say $500 million into Bitcoin maybe doesn't even matter, right? And obviously that would be a very large position even relative to Elon Musk's assets. But again, he doesn't necessarily need that $500 million and it would be fine. And so I put all this into perspective though, right, of like how we advise clients is that we get really clear on what's short term and what's long term. We get really clear on somebody's risk tolerance. We get really clear on their goals of what's sort of not just short term and long term, but what's also medium term coming up. And then from there, we're able to create just a very customized plan. We have roughly 44 clients. We don't have any one client who has the same asset allocation. That's for a number of reasons, but I don't believe in models. I think that models cookie cutter clients into asset allocations that are not appropriate for them. And also people come in with different positions that maybe from a tax perspective don't make sense to sell and that are sort of similar to something else that they would be holding. And therefore, right, their asset allocation, even though if everything on paper were exactly the same, might be different just based on what they were holding before. And again, no two people are, I think, exactly the same. And therefore, again, it might not be necessarily appropriate. But I think for people, though, this is hard to hear because for so many years they've been hearing about like different rules of thumb with asset allocations in stocks and bonds. And with Bitcoin, I don't necessarily think that I can't necessarily just pinpoint for somebody what that rule of thumb should be. And so I feel like in these instances, I feel like your 1 to 10% allocation probably makes sense for somebody who's new and starting out and just heard about Bitcoin and isn't necessarily so involved. But 1 to 10% allocations actually for people who've been involved for a while might actually not be appropriate. It might need to be a much larger allocation. So we actually have clients that run anywhere between even 0% because they're not interested or willing to have Bitcoin in their portfolio, to basically being 100% Bitcoin, assuming that they also have their emergency reserve, just because that's what's appropriate for their situation. And obviously we discuss all the risks and of doing something like that, right? But if a client is dead set on being 100% in Bitcoin, that's really not up to me to decide, right? It's the same thing as if a client came in and they were 100% real estate and they were only doing rental properties. There's so many risks to a client just doing that, right? But at the end of the day, as a financial advisor, we can't force people to sell assets that they don't want to sell. And so I think like kind of the crux of the financial plan is like, how do we plan around what somebody is doing if they're not willing to make changes? And how do we make sure that they understand the risks associated with what they're doing? Yeah, so I do think that people at some point are supposed to sell their Bitcoin. I know this is really hard for Bitcoiners to hear, but I do think that you're supposed to sell it. And I also don't think that taking a loan against your Bitcoin for the purposes of consumption is really worthwhile. I think that people often think, okay, well, I'll just borrow against it and then, Bitcoin will keep going up in value and therefore I won't have to worry about it. And then the amount that I'm borrowing now today is going to be so relevant to the price of Bitcoin in the future that it doesn't matter. And I think that this is a very fiat mindset to be in, to be honest. We are using like basically the fiat unit of account to tell us what Bitcoin is worth.
Happen is get leverage called in your retirement, right?
I mean, I get that we live in a fiat world. But also if you're somebody who's 90% in Bitcoin, right, then you're already bought into the fact that like the future is Bitcoin, right? And so to still be thinking about what my Bitcoin is worth in dollar terms, I think is sort of irrelevant. And also, if we think about the costs of borrowing, they're quite steep. The average lender right now is lending somewhere between, I think it's like 15 and 16% on the loan. So right there, that's capital gains tax. You also have loan origination fees. They're somewhere between 1% and 2% that happen every 1 to 2 years on the loan, and that's on the total loan balance. And so when you actually do the math on it, it's actually not cheaper to loan, right? And so what we're betting on, I want to use the word bet, is that the future price of Bitcoin is going to be so significantly higher compared to this consumption loan that I'm taking that's going to be irrelevant. But in the meantime, I'm paying interest and costs along the way, and potentially actually going to be sold out of my Bitcoin should I borrow too much against it. Bitcoin's price goes against me during a volatile time, and then I actually end up with less Bitcoin than I started with. And so I don't think that all of those things are taken into account, because I think what happens is, and this is no knock on you, your podcast is amazing, and you're a great interviewer, but people listen to a lot of podcast content, and there's a lot of it out there. They listen to the podcast content, they read all the books, right there. You can find basically Bitcoin anything all day, right? I heard of somebody at a conference that I was at where he literally put on, like, he had it all lined up of all the live podcasts, and he would listen to like Bitcoin content from like 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Every single day, and then he would move on to other Bitcoin content while he was working. And and
talk about an echo chamber.
It's one of those things where then we think, okay, Bitcoin is an inevitability. And I do think that there's a non-zero probability that's inevitability, but we still have to live in reality's terms and also understand the asset that we hold. And so if we're keeping all that in mind, right, Bitcoin's price in the future might actually be irrelevant, right? It could be $1 trillion a coin, but if like the dollar is worthless, right, then who cares if it's $1 trillion a coin? And so Like when I'm talking to Bitcoiners about retirement, we're talking about how to preserve this asset in a way that makes sense, and also maybe spend the minimum of it so that we're creating this multi-generational wealth transfer. For a lot of people, that's important. Or, maybe touching on some of those other aspects of a financial plan of like helping the community, not just helping ourselves, helping our family, helping ourselves from a spiritual perspective, or finding a way to be creative in this world, right? Or even finding our place. All of these things come into not spending all of your Bitcoin during your lifetime and dying with zero. And I think that concept of die with zero is a very fiat concept, and that doesn't really have a place in a Bitcoin world. And so, I did some research on this, and I basically created these actuarial tables where we have people living out to age 100 and what like a very conservative withdrawal rate would be. And people don't like to hear this because then, at age, let's say 50, they're only spending 2% of their Bitcoin to make sure that they can last to age 100. But that is really the most conservative perspective of how to look at it. And, like if you're able to spend less than that, obviously you'll have a much like greater way of transferring wealth over time. And if you're spending more than that, right, you have like, there's enough conservatism built into that you'll be okay. And so I feel like it's a good starting off point. People can find that. It's my blog post is on the Bitcoin Financial Advisors Network, and there's a blog on there, and there's a few other financial planners like me that are on that website who are also doing good work. And there's actually a slew of different blogs on there, but you can find my retirement post there. It's called Does Bitcoin Make Retirement Planning Obsolete? And then to get to your point about estate planning, I think that like options are still limited. However, they're not hopeless. So there's multi-sig, right? And so one of the great ways I think is that either you don't have to use a third party, but you could use a third party, let's say like Unchained or Casa or Thea, some of these providers out there where, they hold one key, you hold two, or you hold one, your heirs hold one and they hold one, right? And then like come time for like when you die, right, your heirs present the death certificate and so forth. And then the third party can actually help them move it with the key. That's one way to do it. Not all Bitcoiners like getting other people involved. Totally understand. You could just set up a regular multi-sig on your own. And you could actually teach your family how to use the hardware wallet and show them where, one of them is at the very least during your lifetime. My hope would be, though, that if you're going to set up something like that, that you have enough people in your life that are trusted, that you don't think are just going to run off with your Bitcoin, where you can actually share where your private key material is, and that you actually teach them how to use it, right? If they're a trusted person, they're not going to, let's say, walk off with all of your money. For most people, I think that's going to be their spouse right off the bat. Right? The last thing you want to be doing is like you get into some sort of horrible accident. You're on basically your deathbed. And instead of, enjoying whatever precious moments you have left with your family, you're trying to explain to your wife or your kids or whoever it is, the hardware wallet is, the passphrase is, it's just like, I don't think that's anybody's most fulfilled life, right? And so at some point, either we need to like trust a third party in a way where that third party can't actually move anything, right, without there being true proof of death in this situation, or trust your family members enough to be able to do something with it after your lifetime. The last thing I would say, though, is that trust planning is going to be really important, especially for Bitcoiners that have significant positions. And I would say significant is going to be really anything that's 20% or more of your net worth, to make sure that like this doesn't become a probate asset. Probate is the public process that happens to people after they die of basically how the estate is administered. And that's public in most states. It really does depend on the state. We live in Texas. Here in Texas, it's actually a private process. Like probate itself is public, but the assets that somebody holds is a private process. Whereas in most states that's not the case. It's very public, in which case like the address at which somebody has their Bitcoin stored could be made public, in which case also the value, right? Anyone would know, and then they would associate, let's say, that amount with the person who passed away, and then know that the family members now have it. And then they can actually like watch that address and where the money moves, right? And so I feel like for a lot of Bitcoiners, that's a nightmare of like all of a sudden my privacy has been completely it's gone, right? Poof. And so a trust is going to help with that. A trust will make it such that you don't go through probate. So even if you don't need a trust for anything else, if you just have a revocable living trust for your Bitcoin and you assign the Bitcoin to that trust, and then you have the Bitcoin pass through the trust, then, it's done in all the legal ways. I think also what I hear from Bitcoiners quite a lot is, well, I don't need to do that because like my wife knows where it is and she'll just find the hardware wallet and like it'll all just pass outside the system. And it's like, no, this is the legal way for it to pass outside the system. If your wife ever needs to bring it back for whatever reason into the fiat world, there's going to be questions that are asked. Whereas in this case, there won't be, because a trust was created, and she can very clearly show, hey, a trust was created, and like, we did everything above board. And so again, I feel like there are legal ways to do the things that Bitcoiners want to do now. They just don't want to hear that sometimes.
And unfortunately, at the end of the day, Bitcoiners really just want to avoid counterparties entirely. And I get that that's the point of Bitcoin. It's an intermediary-less financial system. But at the end of the day, whenever you have to assume that you're no longer going to exist in our human form in this reality on this earth, right? You naturally want that Bitcoin to be passed to somebody else. That somebody else, by definition, is already a counterparty, whether that's your next of kin, whether that's your spouse, kids, even if you're giving away your wealth entirely through charities or whatever at your time of passing, those are still counterparties. There's no way to, at least in my view, properly administer the transfer of those assets without assuming counterparty risk. I just think that it's an inherently flawed assumption that Bitcoiners sometimes make. If we want to pass on assets to counterparties, you have to assume counterparty risk. And hopefully you can fully trust your spouse. Hopefully you can trust your next of kin. I mean, I remember I was having a conversation with a friend of mine one time, and so first off, she told me, like, no, I can't ever let my husband know how to manage the hardware wallets. He's not a tech guy. He just won't understand it, which, okay, fine. If he's not going to be able to do it because he doesn't even know how to operate an iPad, that's a whole nother set of problems. But then she also told me, I was like, well, why don't you teach him? She was like, well, but what happens if he just takes the private keys and divorces me and runs off with the Bitcoin? I'm like, well, okay, you might want to have a deeper conversation about that with your husband at one point in time, right? But if you're not even willing to assume that trust with the people that you're closest to, maybe you should just make assumption that you're not going to be passing your Bitcoin on to anyone at any point in time anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem is that if we don't trust anybody, it's a very sad life, right? And I don't think it's a very fulfilling life for people. And it's not the reason why we're here. And, whether you're a religious person or not, right? Like, I mean, I like to think that I'm here on earth for a purpose, and that I was created, and I tell this to my children all the time. Each one of you are created for a purpose, and God put you on this earth for a very special mission. And you don't know that mission yet, but you will find that mission out, and you will be able to make a difference on earth. And that's what you're supposed to be doing here. And I think that even if you think that we came out of the mud from amoebas or whatever people think, right? That like you're still, otherwise, if you don't give your life meaning and purpose in some other way, then why are we doing any of this at all? Why are you saving on this earth now? And in fact, I think, if anything, going back to our die with zero conversation, it means more to die with zero if you don't think that you're here for any purpose, right? You're like, well, I might as well use it because I can't take it to the grave. I often hear that a lot. And so, like, if that's the case too, then okay, now you're living this life where you don't trust anybody. You think you should just basically spend all your assets on earth before you leave because your life doesn't have a purpose and a meaning to it, right? And so I think that you still have to, even if you're not going to believe in the creator, right, you still need to find that greater, that higher purpose, that higher meaning in your life, so that you can make meaningful connections with people and you can make a difference here on earth. Because otherwise, I mean, it's basically like, yeah, what's the point? Why are we here?
I mean, what's the point? It just sounds like a lonely, meaningless existence.
It's nihilism.
Right? Exactly, right? I mean, there's nihilists out there, so okay, each of their own, I suppose. But not the type of life I want to lead, not the type of impression I want to live or leave on the earth after I pass. So, I mean, Morgen, this has been a phenomenal conversation. Hopefully our viewers have learned something today. I understand that you also have a book, Personal Finance, which you're doing a book from, Personal Finance Bitcoin. Maybe if we could do a little quick shameless plug about that. Can you tell us about the Personal Finance Bitcoin book that you're going to be publishing in the next couple of months?
Yeah, sure. So I wrote, back in 2020, I wrote a book called The Personal Finance Quick Start Guide. You can find it on Amazon. It's basically, I mean, I would kind of more describe it as like a financial planning textbook. I tried to basically take everything that was in my brain and put it into a format that made sense for people, that was really kind of practical, and where people can kind of even do numbers in the margins if they wanted to on their own situations. And from there, like, I had a little section on Bitcoin in there. And in there, it's actually what we even talked about, of like the 1 to 10% of net worth. It's kind of, like kind of a more, I would say, like, I guess, normie type
kind of a generic thing, right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but like in my practice, we're dealing with all these really complicated and complex and interesting Bitcoin personal finance issues. And people are coming up with all sorts of things. They're coming out of the woodworks with questions and this and that. And Bitcoin is a very different asset, as we all know. And it's the reason why we're all kind of here doing what we're doing. And so, that got me thinking that maybe there's a place for a Bitcoin personal finance book. And there's a lot of Bitcoin content out there, but there actually is really nothing on financial planning and nothing on financial planning related to Bitcoin specifically. And it was one of the reasons why I wrote my other book was that I felt like there was a lot of books on behavioral finance and there were a lot of books on personal finance, but there weren't a lot of books that kind of combined behavioral finance with personal finance. And so that's what like the personal finance quick start guide aims to do is connect what we were talking about earlier of like putting the human side behind finance and making sure that investment policy statement that you're creating for yourself isn't just sort of this bland, dry document that doesn't mean anything or matter in the grand scheme of things. And so I want to take that framework and now apply it to Bitcoin and really make it like Bitcoin practical. And so I'm like, I'm still going, and I hope it's published by the end of the year, or at least like the manuscript is done by the end of the year is kind of what I'm hoping for. And then we'll see from there, and hopefully it changes a lot of people's lives and helps them make decisions. I'm not, even though I am a financial planner, I'm not a believer that everybody needs a financial planner. I've often heard that in financial planning circles that, oh, if you have any money at all, if you even have $1 to your name, you could use financial planning. I don't think that that's actually true. I think for most people, they need a good budget and they need to stick to it. And they need to save money. And for most people, that's going to mean 20% pre-tax of their income. And after that, once they've accumulated some assets, then they're probably going to come up or find themselves in a position where they have all sorts of interesting financial planning problems. And at that point, I think that's when a financial planner comes in. And so my hope is that the book can get somebody to a point where they're either able to completely do it on their own or they find themselves at an impasse and they realize that they need help.
Well, I know you're going to sell at least one copy of your financial planning Bitcoin book because I will certainly be picking that up once it becomes available. So please keep me informed so I make sure I can pick that one up whenever it's out. Morgen, thank you so much for joining us on the show. I certainly learned a few things today. I hope our viewers did as well. And I think we're going to have to invite you back once the book is published and I can take a quick read through it.
That would be great. Thank you so much, Patrick.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.